You wake to the tolling of bells over Madrid, deep, deliberate, and wrong. Their echo rolls across the rooftops like thunder caught in stone. The air smells of wax and winter smoke, and in the heart of the royal palace you stand among courtiers with faces pale as altar cloths. The bells say a prince has been born, but the silence that follows tells another truth. Something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. Before we descend into the secret chambers of Europe's most cursed dynasty, take a moment to breathe in the past. If stories like this, of power, decay, and the fragile bodies that carried empires, speak to you, consider joining this growing community. It's wild to think that from Lahore to Lisbon, Sao Paulo to Seoul, we can gather here to witness the same echoes of history. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Now, let's step back to November 6, 1661. The dawn that birthed Charles of Habsburg broke cold over Castile. In the royal bedchamber, tapestries shimmered in candlelight, embroidered saints watching as Queen Mariana screamed through a labor that had already lasted 14 hours. Her attendants whispered prayers to the Virgin. Others muttered charms under their breath. The midwives would later swear that the moment the child arrived, the candles flickered and nearly went out. At first, there was no cry. Just a limp, blue infant, head grotesquely large and mouth slightly open as if in perpetual astonishment. One midwife pressed her ear to his chest and drew back in terror. "No life," she whispered. Another crossed herself and began to reach for the linen shroud. But then, impossibly, the child moved. A shallow, struggling breath that sent the room into pandemonium. The queen wept. The courtiers knelt. A priest thrust a crucifix toward the cradle as if fending off a demon. Only when the boy coughed, a wet, rattling sound that filled the silence, did the palace erupt in shouts of relief. The heir to Spain lived. But, from the beginning, whispers stalked that cradle. The midwives who had seen his face were sworn to secrecy. The royal physician, summoned from Toledo, wrote in his journal that the infant is weak of constitution and most unusually proportioned. His note was burned the next morning by royal order. By noon, heralds were already announcing to the streets of Madrid, "A prince is born, healthy and strong." Behind the closed doors of the Alcazar, though, the truth could not be buried so easily. Queen Mariana refused to let the baby out of her sight. She dismissed wet nurses for crossing themselves, exiled servants who murmured about curses. The child's head lolled to one side, his eyes wide and unfocused. He would not feed without choking, and when he slept, his mouth fell open as though gasping for air that would not come. Physicians came and went in uneasy silence. One recommended leeches, another suggested binding the infant's limbs to strengthen the humors. None dared speak what they suspected. The prince's deformities were not a punishment from God, but the visible inheritance of his blood. For 10 generations the Habsburgs had married their own cousins, believing that purity preserved divine favor. Now, in this fragile body, their devotion had taken its final form. At court, the rumor spread that the child was enhechizado, bewitched. Superstitious nobles whispered that the queen had angered some hidden power. Others said that the devil himself had marked the boy. To quell the talk, King Philip IV ordered that all who served in the birthing chamber swear an oath of silence under pain of death. A proclamation declared the prince a child of perfect health and spirit. But even the painters could not lie forever. When Charles was 5, his first portrait was commissioned by Juan Carreño de Miranda. The artist later confided to a fellow painter that the sight of the child shook his soul. He wrote that the boy's gaze was both vacant and knowing, as though aware of what he represented. Miranda softened the angles, rounded the head, disguised the slack jaw with the delicate tilt of a collar, but even in paint, something unsettling remained. The viewers felt it too, a sense that the canvas was keeping a secret. The palace became a fortress of denial. Foreign ambassadors were instructed never to inquire about the prince's health. Tutors were told to praise him for every small motion, every syllable that escaped his lips. When Charles began to walk, years later than he should have, the event was celebrated with fireworks and masses across Madrid. Yet in private, Queen Mariana confessed to her confessor, "It is as though God lent him life only by mistake, and fears to take it back." Outside the palace, Spain was fracturing. Famine, war, and inflation gnawed at the empire's edges, but within the walls of the Alcazar, time moved differently. Every sigh from the prince's chamber sent ripples through the court. Servants claimed to hear him crying at night, not in pain, but in a low, animal wail that made the hair rise on their arms. A few refused to enter his room after dark. One was caught sprinkling salt in the doorway to keep the spirits away. And yet, the boy survived. Year after improbable year, he clung to life with the stubborn tenacity of something that should not exist, but does. Doctors called it a miracle. The priests called it proof of divine favor. None could see that what they were celebrating was not a miracle at all, but a warning, a fragile, gasping prophecy of the empire's decay. When King Philip died, leaving the sickly child as heir, the court erupted in uneasy applause. The church bells rang again over Madrid, just as they had the day he was born. But those who heard them this time swore the sound was different, slower, heavier, as though the metal itself knew it was tolling not for a coronation, but for a beginning of an end. And somewhere deep in the Alcazar, the new king, barely able to stand, jaw hanging open, eyes unfocused, was dressed in the robes of majesty. The courtiers cheered, the priests sang, and no one dared to ask aloud the question that hung in the incense-thick air. How long can a kingdom survive when its very heartbeat was never meant to live? Long before Charles II gasped his first breath in the alcoves of Madrid, the fate that shaped him had already been written, not in prophecy, but in pedigree. In the candlelit courts of Vienna and Toledo, the Habsburgs had been perfecting a dangerous art, the manipulation of blood. They believed themselves chosen, vessels of divine authority, sanctified by God and sealed by lineage. But the longer they clung to that illusion of purity, the more their blood began to resemble the very thing they feared, corruption. To understand the body of Charles, one must first understand the mind of his ancestors. The story begins with the union of two empires, the Spanish and Austrian crowns, and a family so vast and interwoven that even their priests struggled to recite their genealogies. The Habsburgs ruled over a world where sunlight never set, stretching from the silver veins of the New World to the shadowed forests of Bohemia. They were emperors, kings, and consorts. Yet their obsession was not dominion, it was control. The kind that began at the altar and ended in the cradle. In portraits, they appear eternal. Men with elongated faces, solemn eyes, and proud, jutting jaws. Women whose chins tilt upward, lips tight as if guarding secrets too dangerous to speak. That jaw, the infamous Habsburg jaw, was both badge and warning. It appeared first as a quirk, then as a curse, deepening with every generation. By the time of Philip II, it had become unmistakable, a protrusion that warped smiles into grimaces and turned conversation into labor. But to the Habsburgs, this was no flaw. It was identity. They saw resemblance as sanctity, proof that their line remained untainted by the common world. Better a Habsburg mouth than a stranger's blood, one archduke is said to have remarked over dinner, his words slurred by the very deformity he glorified. The practice was called endogamy, though the word they used was purity. Cousins married cousins, uncles took nieces for wives. When those ties grew too tangled to name, new ones were invented. In Spain, King Philip IV married his niece Mariana of Austria, both grandchildren of Philip III. Their child would be Charles II, born from a line where repetition had replaced renewal. Court genealogists kept meticulous records, lines drawn and redrawn until the family tree resembled not a tree, but a circle. A scholar, centuries later, would calculate Charles's inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, higher than the offspring of a brother and sister. But the numbers only hint at the horror. Imagine a body built from the same fragments repeated too many times. The same jaw, the same frail bones, the same invisible weaknesses, recombined until the code itself began to collapse. Even in their own time, the consequences were visible. Stillbirths multiplied. Infant deaths became routine. Royal nurseries filled with tiny coffins carved from cedar and silk. The women of the family aged young, their skin gray from endless pregnancies. The men grew pale and soft, their features sagging beneath the weight of the blood they carried. Priests offered masses for divine mercy upon the womb. But what they were witnessing was not God's wrath. It was biology exacting its price. Some tried to warn them. Spanish physicians in the 16th century noted the growing pattern of weakness. Court advisors whispered that perhaps the Almighty intended kings to mix with other noble lines. But such talk was dangerous. Purity was politics, and politics was faith. To marry outside the bloodline was to risk the throne itself. A stranger's blood might carry loyalty to another crown. A foreign wife might birth a traitor. And so, generation after generation, the Habsburgs folded inward, until the empire's greatest strength, its unity, became its undoing. There were omens along the way. Emperor Maximilian II, once known for his vigor, died trembling, his body ravaged by seizures. His descendant, Ferdinand IV, was rumored to have coughed up blood for weeks before his death at 21. The chroniclers wrote it as divine trial, but the servants saw the truth. These were not kings touched by angels, but victims of their own lineage. By the 17th century, the portraits themselves began to look haunted. Look closely, and the resemblance is uncanny. The same slanted eyes, the same hollow cheeks, the same stubborn jaw repeating across a dozen faces like a specter trapped in oil and canvas. It was as if time itself had given up inventing new shapes for them. When Charles II was born, he was not the result of one mistake, but of centuries of deliberate choices. His 6 great-grandparents should have numbered 16. His grandmother was also his aunt, his great-grandfather, also his great-great-grandfather. The Spanish court called him El Hechizado, the bewitched one. They thought sorcery had weakened him, but the true witchcraft was arithmetic, the quiet, ruthless mathematics of blood. And yet the Habsburgs persisted. Their priests told them that their suffering was proof of God's favor, that their trials purified their souls even as their bodies failed. It is one of history's cruelest ironies. They sought divinity through blood, and instead found decay through flesh. By the time Charles took the throne, the dynasty's empire still glittered across continents, but its foundation was bone-deep rot. Its armies faltered, its coffers emptied, and its king could not stand without help. The courtiers whispered prayers for a miracle that would never come, and the portraits of his ancestors watched from the walls, mouths slightly open as though laughing at their own creation. The dynasty had devoured itself, and in the boy who bore its name, it left behind a living monument to its own extinction. But Spain did not yet know that the sickness eating its king would soon infect the kingdom itself, that in the years to come, priests and nobles alike would try to drive out not a disease, but a curse. By the end, Spain's most powerful man could barely lift a cup of water. His fingers trembled like candle flames in a draught, his breath rasping through teeth that never closed properly. The courtiers said his body was failing. The priests said his soul was under siege. And Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, began to believe them. In the waning years of the 17th century, the royal court had turned into a cathedral of fear. The king's chambers in the Escorial were heavy with incense and whispers, thick with the scent of damp stone and burnt myrrh. His nights were sleepless, tormented by visions of shadowed figures and the laughter of unseen voices. He would wake screaming for his mother, long dead, calling her name into the dark. "She stands at my bed," he told his confessor, "but she does not bless me." His body, already twisted by disease, became a battlefield between medicine and miracle. Physicians prescribed potions of mercury and crushed pearls. They bled him until he fainted, burned his skin with heated irons, and forced him to swallow draughts of donkey's milk at dawn. None of it eased his pain. The king, once anointed as the earthly vessel of divine authority, now reeked of rot and despair. When science failed, faith took its place. A Dominican friar was summoned to perform an exorcism, not upon a sinner, but upon a sovereign. The church debated in secret. Could a king be possessed? Could God's chosen bear the mark of hell? The verdict came whispered in Latin, non homo, sed regnum est in periculo. It is not the man, but the kingdom in peril. The ceremony was held at night. Witnesses described a hall lit only by candles, their light shivering against the gilt crucifix. The king lay on a pallet, eyes wide, lips moving in prayer or delirium. Holy water dripped down his face, tracing the deep folds of his chin like tears. The priest intoned the ancient words, voice trembling, "Depart, spirit of corruption. Leave this vessel of the Lord." Charles convulsed, limbs jerking violently. Courtiers gasped. Some fell to their knees, believing the devil himself was resisting. But what they took for the struggle of demons was the collapse of a body devoured from within, a lifetime of inherited ruin finding its end. Still, the rituals continued. The king's food was blessed before every meal. His bed was surrounded by relics, the thigh bone of St. Vincent, a vial of the Virgin's milk, a splinter of the true cross. Each day brought a new miracle promised and another failure delivered. Spain's physicians wrote reports that read like prayers. One observed, "His Majesty does not digest. He only decays." As his strength waned, the empire followed. The armies starved. The treasury bled. Famines swept Castile, and rumors spread that the king's curse had infected the land. The people whispered that Spain was bewitched, that God was withdrawing his favor, one heartbeat at a time. Charles himself began to echo their fear. "I am bewitched," he told his confessor one autumn evening, his voice barely audible. "I feel the devil inside me, gnawing at my heart." When he spoke, saliva pooled at the corner of his mouth. His tongue was too heavy, his words dragging as though pulled from a great depth. In his final year, desperate for proof, the priests ordered his body exhumed while he still lived, metaphorically, through divination. They consulted astrologers who traced his fate in the stars, and mystics who cast wax into holy water to watch how it melted. The verdict returned like thunder. The curse is old as his blood. It cannot be undone. On the 1st of November, 1700, the bells of Madrid tolled once more. The king, who should never have lived, had finally died. His body weighed scarcely more than a child's. When the embalmers opened him, they found his organs shriveled, his heart the size of a walnut, his intestines blackened, and, as one chronicler wrote, his body without a drop of blood. The physicians crossed themselves. The priests whispered that the devil had taken what was his. But in truth, there had never been any demon, only centuries of devotion to a name that mistook decay for destiny. Outside the palace, Spain fell silent. The dynasty that had ruled the world was gone. And somewhere in the echo of the bells, the empire seemed to breathe its last. A kingdom exorcised not by holy water, but by extinction.